Hello. I think we are ready to start. Thank you everyone for coming. This is our second event in the lecture series Scavengers and Other Creatures. This is Ricardo deOstos. I'm Nannette Jackowski. We organized this series in order to relate to the work of our unit here at the school, at the AA, Intermediate Unit 3, with underlying thematics, such as today's focus on assembling realities, or in other words, how information is shaped today. This is, just for you to know, there will be a third event in the series, and this is all to do with discussing an upcoming publication on the unit's work. So again, as I said already, this is trying to relate to the unit with certain themes that we are covering and our own interests as well. However, the most important part for us in this series are the guest speakers and how, in a way, they have accepted to discuss the given subject through the lens of their own work. And perhaps they can confront their work today with the thematic from a certain tangent point. So today, again, we have invited 3 architects, all of them with very different approaches to architecture and very different results. Concentrating on either architecture itself, performances, public art, or digital technologies. The first speaker today that we're going to see is Carsten Hunek from OSA, Office for Subversive Architecture. Founded by Carsten Hunek and Bernd Trümpler, OSA originated in 1995 as part of a student project and began to grow as a collective of practitioners with similar ideas on architecture and public space. Their consistent aim has been to develop what they call untraditional approaches to reinterpret architecture in the city. OSA's projects cross the boundaries between art and architecture, varying from minimal or movable installations to the construction of actual buildings and urban or spatial strategies. Our second speaker today is Dr. Vesna Petressin from Rubedo. Vesna Petressin is a time architect, space composer, and performer. She's a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths, University of London, and artist in residence at ZKM in Karlsruhe in Germany. The practice integrates multiple material supports such as sound, space, moving image, or physical performance, and uses customized digital and analog tools. It takes art out of the white cube to an immersive experience. And our third speaker is Robert Stuart Smith. Robert directs the architectural practice Robert Stuart Smith Design. He's a co-founding partner of the design research practice Kokuja and a studio course master in the AA School's DRL, the Design Research Laboratory. Rob studied architecture in the UK, France, and Australia, and holds a master's in architecture and urbanism from the AA of architecture design at the DRL as well. So before we come to the speakers, we also briefly want to introduce the theme and how we relate to it, or our interest in it. So the question we want to ask first is, are we too late to experiment in architecture? In our last series, in our last event in November, which was called Projecting Realities, we discussed the work of architect Lewis Woods and the importance of his legacy through the work of 3 world-class and in-house agent provocateurs, connecting points of sympathy between their work and the one from Lewis. Perhaps one of the elements that we could start to come to terms was that Lewis' work and his unapologetic confrontation with political and urban construction systems do not necessarily mean a refusal of reality, and that his drawings models, and meditation renderings formed part of an ongoing recreation of experiments with concepts so deeply architectural: the ground, the body, the landscape, the user, and the collective. The work and the architect were very experimental and, in a strange way, never too antagonistic to the arms of theory. It is precisely on this tension between theory and intuition that we wanted to set up the boundaries of today's event called Assembling Realities.
So carrying on this idea of assembling realities, the idea of experimentation was explored in the conference accompanied by this book, Theory plus Experimentation, Intellectual Extravaganza. This is a very interesting book. It was published in 1993, and it basically counts with 36 international architects, basically the who is who in the architecture of the late 80s and 90s. So you have names like Tschumi, Peter Cook, Odilia Deck, Eric Overmars, Zaha, Hadid, Tom Main, Lebels Woods, and several other architects. And among many things, apart from the inability of architects to agree with each other on the first 10 pages of the book, they cover a great ground on the extension and release exercise discussing anxieties of the time, which was the question of what should come first, experimentation or theory, or experimentation and theory. Should we think like a scientist, experimenting first and then constructing hypotheses as exposed by Ken Kaplan? Or perhaps advance on Tchumi's discussion of architecture amid mass media cultural shock while proposing acts of engaging with information and fast developing technology in order to create moments of defamiliarization and further events in the mediated metropolis. As a continuation of our adventures in our own interest in the unit and within the school, the architectural associations, we want to ask today how we work with information and how we assemble the building up of architecture with so many possibilities to choose from. One might say the architecture is the result of client's brief or the people's need, a cultural manifestation of the software or the software scripts, or even perhaps the algorithm that multiply the possibilities of connecting the dots between the hardware of the robotic arm and the software of the human brain. There are so many fields related to architecture now open to speculation, to avid curious scrutiny, and ultimately to the psychological couch treating the troubling notion that which today understands every bit of information as a bit of problematic information. As the French philosopher and anthropologist Bruno Latour said when writing about politics and nature, it seems that the political ecology implodes any possibility of a politics of nature by separating into two cliffs the non-human nature, Amazonian frogs, ocean tides to running water, to the social constructed world order, from endangered Amazonian frogs to rising ocean levels to running water depletion. On one side, the activities of a deep ecology armed with mesmerizing data asks for commitment, acknowledgement, and balance with nature, while the other side, politics, cannot ignore human relations, basically what politics is here to do, in favor of non-human relations. In a strange way, there seems to be a systematic relationship between every piece of information about nature and the interesting or the interestness addition of human association, in this case, the environmental trauma, endanger, rise, depletion. That same tension of every single piece of information being subject to rediscovery and generating lust for more information is what perhaps renders experimentation a valid way to think building architecture again. Again, that question of the book Theory plus Experimentation, or Theory or Experimentation. Yes, building architecture, not only building or architecture, but working on its practice in the process of selecting, scripting, discarding, and drawing a little more. We have often been delighted and very often been afraid of internet government security protocols, drone surveillance politics of global data and homogenization of public space in cities. The difference between endorsing another interesting problematic information and testing its interestness against its relevance is perhaps of how we tested, bitted, and reconstructed under new compositions. This is a process of experimenting, a necessity to do something about reinventing information out of its amusement and into association of process. So how information get out of this interestness into a series of compositions and associations. It is exactly because we do not know what to do with drone surveillance, house price financial algorithms, or affordable 3D printing that we should throw it against the wall, hurted, mistreated, because there is no certainty, no direct reference to tame it, to domesticate it into another disciplinary category. The other option to theorize the amusement into fractal positions are so-called the argument. Would be created more pollution in the already crowded field of interdisciplinary architecture of interestness in the phantom world of the infocalypse. So what should we do? Should we bounce big data against the domino house? Should we play ping pong between digital fabrication and postmodern historicism? There are lessons to learn, analogies to construct, but the point is the priority of where the action of maneuvering and molding information in architecture will lead to more information on information, knowledge on knowledge, or to practice of forms that we want to experiment with the reposition of interestness into a partial relevance of specific actors, parameters, and a massive amount of errors to learn from the process of experimentation. In the book Theory Plus Experimentation, just finalizing, Itsuo Hasegawa avoids generalities to mount her practice out of evolving morphology of Tokyo. And she says, her intention is, quote, to create architectures to express what one has experienced in life as a human being by using a completely different vocabulary. My approach to architecture is an ad hoc rather than exclusively formal development. That different vocabulary might in our case be a shift between reference and proposition, information and form. Experimentation might open up a new interest in between the process and the building practicing. If there is a crisis today, it is probably the crisis of fact-checking. By scrutinizing information with experimentation, one might restore the terrain of tension where there is no need for safe ground, stable plateaus, confronted trenchant arguments, and unchecked facts and matters. Assembling realities, the theme of the conference today, might be synonymous with tinkering internal rules of architecture, while the argumentative collage might propose a stable ground, perhaps trenched ground, for banal architectures. Experimentation might free architecture today to play with the banality of the world, without feeling guilty or not caring for global problems or the Freudian culture of interestness of problematic information. So are we too late to experiment with architecture? Perhaps, but if you can assemble realities through the practice of building associations and process, we might have an output and a body of work to discuss publicly and evolve disciplinary. And I think that idea of the assembling realities is start tackling this, and the notion that we have, in fact, three designers to talk about how they work with information is the next step to carry on discussing that idea of perhaps experimentation has to do with a process, but we let to the speakers to discuss in their own way what they think about the thematic. I would like to invite Karsten.
So there will be now about 20 minutes each per speaker presentation, and we follow up with a discussion in the end.
Yeah. Hello everybody, I'm Carsten Huneck from OSA, and thanks a lot Nannette and Ricardo for inviting me for this very, very interesting topic. I very briefly introduce the network of OSA and how we approach projects in general. As Nannette already explained, it started as a student organization or collective when we were all at the university. We are 8 members or partners, but we are not a company, not a practice registered as such. We are a collective, a true collective, which works fluently over in Europe mainly, but also outside Europe. But we live in 3 different countries and have a common view on how we approach works, and in particular how we push these boundaries between architecture, art, and other different disciplines, where we actually include a lot of other experts. And I think I always like to say that all the projects we are usually approaching are telling a story, and that's really important to us, the narrative of the project. And that they are born out of an idea which, considering the inherent nature of the specific space, be it an empty site, or be it in a very dense city, or be it actually an already existing building or site. So there are very different approaches. We do performances, like this kind of human modules with black umbrellas on Trafalgar Square, which was one of our first projects in London. We do guerrilla architecture, where we just be hands-on, we find a space which interests us and we take over. And in this case, we refurbished the signal box in East London overnight. But we are also interested in existing spaces which we just subtly or non-subtly alter with a very simple method. In this case, a car park in Cologne, which we turned upside into the vertical. But we also do structures. This temporary pavilion for the Liverpool Biennale. But for the topic today, I decided to show 3 projects which deal with the theme of the information and the assembly in a different way. I deliberately chose 3 projects which deal with a space which is existing and which is buildings which are doomed to be demolished. So they actually, one can say, came to an end of their life, and people were either angry about them because they found them ugly, or they just needed to make space for new developments, for developers to make money, or simply to make way for even very good new developments. However, what interests us in that sense is what else than the bricks and mortar and the glass and the physical elements of the buildings or the architecture is actually relevant. And there's 3 different projects where we deal on a slightly different angle with the problem. In this case, we were invited to create a piece within one of the apartments in this block in Antwerp. They invited 8 artists, and we got one of the apartments. And we knew 4 weeks or 6 weeks later they wanted to start demolishing it. So they said, you are very free with what you want to do with the space inside. Have a site visit, of course, we all met. And when we arrived, we saw the last flat which was inhabited, and we met the owners. It was a family, Belgian-Moroccan family with 3 kids. And they still had their belongings in there. In fact, they didn't want to leave, and you could sense all the building was abandoned apart from that one flat. And they already had another flat just on another side not far. But they were adamant to stay. They didn't dare to believe they have to move out, in a sense. So they basically prolonged the exit. So we thought, this is very interesting. We like to work with that flat, and we like to work with them. And we thought, isn't it interesting to ask them, because they had so many things, and we knew they would leave a lot of that or put it in the dump. So we said, okay, can we work with the belongings you are leaving in the flat? And they agreed. So we then thought about, okay, we are creating a piece which is not accessible. So we basically are not able to enter the flat. So the visitors who come to the opening, they can't actually access the flat. The door's locked. We even put some concrete panels in front of the windows. So we deleted the flat already in order to create a virtual reality, or what we also sometimes call a real virtuality, by installing this screen in the door with a joystick. And inside the flat, there was a remote-controlled car with a camera, which you could steer from the door, but you never could enter the space. So we played, in a way, in the sense where we are at this world, with the virtual gadgets and games and the internet, but with a real space. And to explore the real space, the last moment of this building, in a way, you explore already through the camera, almost in a computer game. And you see here, the people were quite excited, particularly.
Ziet het daar mensen? Nee.
They were then starting playing around.
Nee, maar het lopen daar mensen.
And really
Niet
interesting
steken
how
in de muur draaien.
to get into the space. They wanted
Oh!
to into the space, but they couldn't.
Ziet men het perfect, maar ik ben geen perfecte shot.
And then we also, because they had at the corner of the building, they had a little open cafe where they had this kind of collection of old images of the whole estate. It was quite a famous social housing block, 80 years old or so. So in a way, there were a lot of memories there, they were fond of the building. And what we did, we installed another screen which portrayed the live image of the flat, of what the people were doing with the flat, onto the same wall, in a sense. So in a way, playing already with the images which will remain forever, even though the space is still there just for 4 or 6 weeks. So it was really interesting how you play already with the imagery, which is real, but will be virtual in the future. And another building, also I think that is being demolished now, in Leeds, which is very interesting because it's an international pool building. It's a swimming pool, quite famous, from John Paulson, an English architect, which was very liked because it's unlike many other leisure centers or pools in the center of Leeds. So people had really easy access to the pool, and we were very intrigued by the task of creating a public art piece which should celebrate the building before it goes. And it was a part of a competition, and we obviously again went on site to see how the space looks. And what was really interesting is the way when the pool is empty, how intriguing that is. And we knew it will be emptied. So we thought about a piece which somehow merges into the existing fabric. You can see they have this roof light, which is square. And we thought we install a virtual water collector, which collects virtual water, but in essence collects or stores memories of the people. It was quite a big public event with a big opening, so the people who really cared about the building came, and we also projected some of the old images against the diving pool. But what we really thought is we insert this very, in a way, minimal virtual water collector, stretch fabric piece, which literally merged into this roof light. We used the existing steel beams of the roof light and just attached this. You can see it's like 50 by 50 profile to it, and purely the weight of the ring formed the whole piece. So the overall piece was just 600 kilograms or so. But the effect was enormous. So in a sense, we merged it into the existing, but at the same time we created something new, and we created an atmosphere which really made it like this kind of farewell where the people were contemplating about the past of this building. Interestingly, some things which usually you don't know when you start a project, that the structure behind this is big trusses, and we simply installed 4 big floodlights. They were just turning, so nothing fancy, and created this amazing shadow game with the existing structure behind, which is something you sometimes come across when you do a project. You haven't even planned for that, but suddenly you create this amazing effect. So yeah, in this case, that really played with the memories and also with the moment of disappearance of the building in a sense. The third project, also an existing building, which doomed to be demolished, is part of, was a festival a year ago, so it's basically one of our most recent projects, which is interesting because it's in a town which suffered from the downturn of the coal mining in the West German area. And what the problem with a lot of the cities is that they had this boom in the 60s, 70s, and they built these massive structures, housing in this case, which were really liked. They were fancy, they were fashionable, people wanted to move in. But over the time, as we all know, they become not fashionable, not liked, but also because of the downturn, they got more and more abandoned. So people were very, very against this. And it's interesting how a building over its life goes through the different phases of the highs and lows. And when we arrived, we heard only these people talking, yeah, it needs to go, it's ugly, it's awful. We went inside, we found it very interesting, so we said, okay, we're going to work with this. The festival was about urban area, like this, the particular urban area of Berghamen, and light. So it should include light somehow, very freely, given the task. So we were thinking, we really like this tower, we want to work with it. And there were lots of ideas even to reinvigorating new functions, etc. But the developer already decided to knock it down and build a shopping mall instead, which will never work there in our opinion. But that's a different story. What was interesting to us is that the information, and that comes also back to the topic again, the building stored over the years. And apart from that, it seems to be an ugly structure, which I don't even think so. It's actually very interesting. But the information, the additional subjects which are stored, that's what was interesting us. Here you can see it in its setting, the bus stop. And now a few images of what we've done before I show a film. We teamed up with theater scientists who does a lot of performance and works with interviewing people, citizens, and also portraying certain interviews with radio. So we thought about what if we create the tower as a radio station, which over the duration of the 2 weeks sends all the history, all the interviews we then did with former inhabitants, social workers, mayors, etc., to the people around who didn't know about this. That's the key thing. Once the project started, we went on Facebook, there was a page, etc., and then people started guessing what is actually in there, what has been in there. So then you realize actually people don't even know what the history of the building is, even though they are all ranting about it needs to go. And that led us to the overlay of these different items, the radio with the interviews, the piece itself, which we decided to paint black in order to neutralize it, and in particular at night to make it totally disappearing. And then creating with that a backdrop to project with a laser beam the inside of the building, the architectural structure, the kind of looking behind the block to see what was inside or what is inside. And we did that in a way that it was choreographed. So the stories which you heard over the radio were simultaneously shown in an abstract way by the laser, depicting the certain areas of the tower. And interestingly, because there's different ways of these projections, but we decided to do an anamorphosis, which means it's from one point only where you actually see the overlay of, in this case, the staircase with one flat in the right position. So, of course, from the side, it would be distorted, but that actually created a really interesting effect, additional to the accurate position. We quite like that people were wondering, what is this really distorted effect? And then you go around and then you see suddenly, this is the tower with the stair. I mean, obviously that is the best is to show this with the film. The whole story is portrayed in this film, which is really interesting. Also how the tower looked inside before it got demolished. So I show this now. No. It worked earlier, no? Yeah, I go out to the main folder, then that's fine.
In Berkamen wird aus dem Wohnturm bald ein Leuchtturm. Eigentlich sollte der Wohnturm mal als Wahrzeichen der Stadt gelten. Inzwischen aber steht das 20-stöckige Hochhaus seit 13 Jahren leer.
Die absolut meisten Menschen in dieser Stadt und ich glaube auch in der gesamten Umgebung empfinden ihn als belastend, als störend, angsteinflößend direkt.
Mit großem Aufwand wird der Turm als Kunstaktion zunächst schwarz angestrichen, damit er nachts unsichtbar wird.
Ich meine, wir haben 76 da eingezogen. Da war es sehr schön. Also ich würde jederzeit wieder einziehen, wie es damals war. Na, also, das war schon toll da. Wir hatten alles, was wir brauchen. Das war eine richtige kleine Stadt. Und es war auch ein sauberes Haus. Ich sage ja, da war Teppich, es war Müllschlucker, es waren Putzfrauen, es war also wirklich Komfort. Auch Komfortwohnung war schön. Also da kann man eigentlich gar nichts sagen. Ja.
Berkamener alten Genres sagten damals in den 60ern, als man anfing mit der Bauerei vorher angeblich den alten Friedhof exhumiert hat, von noch vorhandenen Leichen.
Richtig.
Ja.
Die wurden alles umgewidmet.
Wer auf diesen Grund und Boden baut, der hat von vornherein den Fluch des Teufels im Nacken.
Wir haben irgendwann mal mit dem Veterinäramt, mit Feuerwehr, mit Gesundheitsamt sind wir wirklich am Begehung gemacht, um den Zustand des Turms immer wieder auch zu dokumentieren. Ich bin angerufen worden, dass eine Familie mit Kindern eventuell den Kindern was antut, weil sie gerade einen Hund auch aus dem Fenster geworfen hatten, dem anderen Hund ein Bein gebrochen haben. Also solche Sachen sind mir immer gemeldet worden.
Dadurch, dass der Turm schwarz ist und somit bei Nacht total verschwindet, war es dann der Ansatz mit der Laserprojektion, das Innere des Turmes preiszugeben, also die Struktur, die architektonische Aufteilung und gleichzeitig aber eben Geschichten und die Geschichte des Turmes über ein Hörstück zu erzählen.
Sound ist eigentlich so das insofern Zentrale, weil es diese drei Elemente oder die zwei anderen Elemente, die vereinen sich und der Sound ist so quasi der Dreh- und Angelpunkt des Ganzen.
Ja, die Beseelung eines toten Gegenstandes kommt vielleicht dadurch zustande, dass die Laserprojektion ja eine Anamorphose ist. Also das heißt, von dem richtigen Standort aus ist es so, dass wir das Gefühl haben, wir schauen in das Gebäude rein. Also das ist auch ein guter Grund dafür, ihn einfach schwarz zu haben, weil er dann völlig in den Hintergrund tritt. Man hat eher das Gefühl, es steht dort ein dreidimensionales Modell des Gebäudes. Wenn ich hinter die Kulissen, hinter die Mauern eines Gebäudes blicke, ist das immer eine besondere Situation. Dass wir so ins Herz blicken oder in die Seele blicken. Und insofern ist das vielleicht etwas, was den Turm auch zum Abschied dem einen oder anderen noch mal etwas näher bringen kann.
Okay. Thank you.
Carsten, is that your phone?
Oh, that's actually mine.
No.
Right. I'll just leave it here before someone forgets it. Hi, my name is Vesna Petruchin. I have an art practice that stretches across disciplines in media, and I use that as a platform to conduct my research. So you could say that it's an experimental practice. And I use this practice to continuously ask myself questions about the nature of our experience, the reality, and how in the creative field we can actually materialize and bring to life new concepts that were once only in the realm of our imagination. How malleable is space? How malleable is time? We can shape the space and we can edit the events that unfold in time. A lot of my inspiration comes from science. And we have learned that space is not fluid, that is fluid rather than solid, that immaterial can shape the material, and that is specifically true from digital culture. Our environment is structured by information, frequency, sound, rhythm, movement, behavior. Physics demonstrates that sound can shape space. What it raises as a question is how we can structure an environment from mathematical parameters based on sound composition. But pondering about the nature of reality, Pythagoras argues that the material form is being continuously transformed in response to dynamic forces from its environment. And similarly, contemporary physics considers structures in systems at micro and macro scale as transitory and constantly evolving under influence of force fields. The mathematician Whitehead similarly argues that process linking form to behavior rather than substance is the fundamental constituent of the world, and that nature consists of patterns of activity interacting with one another. Below the level of subatomic units, matter is viewed as superstrings or quantum loops, as information. And a lot of physicists argue that matter forms like a crust created by beats of juxtaposed waveforms. In that sense, matter is information. This inspired the piece that we made where particles were assigned fluid properties and were rendered in response to the parameters of the sound piece. The sound piece had a structure that originated from the Fibonacci sequence and that created those beats that gave shape. But what quantum physics also brought to culture are all those questions about the nature of reality and the codependence of the space and the observer. One of the key components, key ingredients of creating a sense of immersion in space is the response as it is real, in a way to persuade our body, to persuade our minds that the experience that we have is actually real and cannot be distinguished from the imaginary. We perceive, construct, and navigate the environment using all senses reactions to a single concept. But single sensory percepts can trigger sensations in other modalities and merge them into a single experience. This is what we call synesthesia, and it has been used extensively by artists and composers that try to relate an experience of art beyond just a concept, but to link it to archetypal notions of patterns, rhythms, movements. This response as if real essentially tells us that the feeling of being in space, empathy, ambiguous structures, and emotional engagement are key to creating a immersive experience. And the audience can subconsciously respond to those rhythms and patterns. The piece that I was just showing before was actually created for an industrial space in South London. Got another installment in the form of a real-time game-like environment, in which the idea that you could create three-dimensional light structures that respond to the movement, the navigation of the user, whenever we hit the trigger point, which has an embedded sound loop, can actually create that immersive synesthetic experience. This is just a screen grab. The universe that we constructed here was based on a couple of topological formations that interacted with each other and that were floating seemingly on this virtual water. And that gave us an idea to translate this experience to the next project, which in a way was a smart landscape. We were trying to reflect on how we actually take this experience of an immersive environment outside of a gallery space, outside of an architectural space, and out in the nature, and redefine what land art could mean. And then another component came in, which was the narrative. We're inspired by the Celtic legend of the city of Eyre, which tells about the beautiful sunken city that only becomes visible once a year on the 1st of May, if the waters are clear. And I felt that that was a wonderful metaphor for sustainability and immersive environment. And the idea here was to create a smart landscape, a sustainable, responsive light and soundscape for a coastal site. A sort of a digital mirage that created an experience of a moving sound on water. This smart light installation is going to be embedded in the supporting structure, which is a kind of a membrane and driven by geodata and scripted content. The Song of Water actually gives an illusion of a siren song floating at the dusk and dawn, and creates this immersive sound environment. But while a lot of these projects were quite abstract in a sense. When we speak about synesthesia, the main component, the main ingredient is actually the brain or the sensory apparatus of the audience themselves. This is where the experience takes place. But after that, I began to examine the hybrids of the body and technology and how we can include the physical component of the human body as a measure of all things, and also how we can include body data and voice as a sculpting tool. Here again, body can directly shape the space. We used a method of simulation of particle fields in animation softwares where objects are composed of particles within fields and they are immersed as agents within general conditions of creating structures, processes, and fluxes. This creates a multidimensional network in which every action is linked to an action of another entity. For example, sound, audio data can be linked to a deformation of form. And in that sense, the musical piece becomes a sculpting tool. We used a 3D scan of the body, and then skin was rendered as a particle field to which deformations were applied. Skin was also considered as the interface between the inside and outside, between the micro and macrocosm, and became an animated element, topologically stretching from the artist to the environment, from the user to the background. Now this way, form becomes a system that can grow in time, react and adapt to change. The form can be considered a dynamic totality of energies under transformation. In this system, sound in a way becomes a primary impulse that initiates movement, rhythm, pattern, and structure. And we have also created a 3D film based on that, and another series of wearable structures. The next couple of years of development are going to take us into experimenting with motion capture, sound and shape recognition softwares, and how that can be translated into a physical, on-stage, real-time experience. Using performance as a sculpting environment, we were then commissioned a live performance for the Paris photo exhibition and invited to reconsider the medium of photography for a synesthetic experience. We performed 4 pieces that featured sound, movement, and light painting at open exposure, and from which still images were created but capture for each of the pieces what the naked eye cannot see in real time. Now, in his book, Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, Gilles Deleuze wrote, Paul Klee's famous formula, not to render the visible, but to render visible, means nothing else. This highlights the artist's sensitivity to non-visible forces and their ability to render those forces visible or tangible. We were inspired by this idea, and so we adopted photography as an instrument during the live performance. It was the body in motion that created shape and structure and fusing it with environment, while the boundaries between the artist and the audience became blurred. This choreography of movement, light, radiation, and resonance were revealed using long exposure photography, which allowed to exceed framing an event as a frozen moment and instead to accumulate a cross-section of time in a two-dimensional medium. Now, time here was considered continuous, contingent with space, and topological. And this way, the photograph actually allows us not only to paint with light, but also to paint with time. So what the eyes can see is no longer the primary interest. This resulting photograph brings to the forefront what the naked eye fails to see during the live performance: the sensations, ambiguities, the subconscious, and the unexplained. So in the practice, what I try to capture is the fact that chaos can reveal an order, a chance becomes part of the structure, and error is just another creative opportunity. Thank you.
So I titled this lecture Complex Events and Orchestrated Becomings with the position that information, as Vesna mentioned, is matter, but you can also think of matter as something dynamic in flux, and that design could be about how we orchestrate that matter towards useful purpose. So this is Godfrey Reggio's Quae which is basically portraying things that we see in one kind of speed of time as something quite different, where everything is in flux. This is a diagram by Christopher Alexander in Notes on the Synthesis of Form that talks about the fact that designers negotiate multiple parameters or constraints within design, and that these have some form of hierarchy within the designer's mind. People like Friar Otto have tried to negotiate some of those parameters through physical models. So in this case, there's a model that's trying to optimize structural performance or the minimization of surface tension, and it operates as a design model. While we can consider architecture as having a history of things such as proportion or relationship, such as with Vitruvius, architecture is a complex entity, similar to a car, assembled from many parts. Complexity in architecture is often associated with people like Robert Venturi, complexity for contradiction, or from complex geometry with people like Frank Gehry. Richard Dawkins talks about complexity, though, as being something that describes an entity made from a heterogeneous set of parts that performs a useful function. Edward Lorenz talks about complexity being something that is sensitive to local dependence, in the sense that a small change in the initial conditions can have a radical difference in the outcome. And he also refers to complexity in terms of a visual aesthetic complexity, like you see on the right, this photograph of snow, where if we were to describe that geometrically, it would take a lot of measurements, such as in a traditional architectural drawing. But if one were to write an algorithm that outlined a behavior, that kind of thing could happen with about 5 lines of code. So there's a complexity that's there for minimal effort. And this complexity is event-driven. And this is where a lot of Kikuja and Robert Stuart Smith designs work, and also the studio and the DRL, have taken on board the idea that design is an event-driven, time-based sequence, and where information is mainly the information to begin with within the design algorithm. And then once one has something that they're creating or inputting, there's the possibility to then start to think about how one can respond to the outside environment. Sometimes this is purely for simple architectural expression, like this is a competition we did for a rock climbing center where it has a very traditional architectural goal. In this sense, the building's trying to define a volume which you perceive as carved out. So it's all about how pattern relates to figure and void, and how that one can perceive that within what is essentially a flat fabricated facade system. So it's all about how this pattern relates to the volume itself, and it's written through a behavioral algorithm that actually runs over a period of time on the volume of the building. In this case, though, we have a concern also for the way different aspects of buildings relate to one another. So this is the National Art Museum of China. It's a first stage competition between Kikuja collaborating with Studio Shupei in China. And the idea was to create a huge glass envelope that would wrap a series of big gallery volumes. And then there would be public space and circulation between the galleries. So in this case, design was something that was done through in time. There was agents, like these basically particles with local rules that coordinate together to wrap the gallery volumes. So it's about creating volume and form through behavior, and through local rules of association, in this case to deal with range of vision and connectivity. They can connect to also form structure. So structure, glazing, and volume and form are all related to each other. And you can see it through this model that's now in Frack's permanent collection, where you see, you can start to see the glazing tiles, which are all the same size and shape, they just have a different overlap, and the glazing structure beneath them. And these things, depending on The lighting, you see either a very transparent thing where the structure becomes apparent or where the skin becomes apparent. In this case, though, as I mentioned before, the relationship between the whole and the part is something quite complex, but it's arisen through a very simple set of rules. Sometimes these things take on pragmatic concerns as well. Like in this case, this is investigating path optimization for something, a concrete exoskeleton structural condition within this tower project in China. So here the concern is about redundancy, about providing a non-optimal route, but a multiple route for structure to go from the top of the building down to the ground. So load is transferred indirectly. But as it does that, it forms a screen a little bit like Owen Hower's work, which provides for light to pass through, but at the same time has architectural expression. So it's not about an optimal structure so much as a structure that's intrinsic to another architectural concern. This is a competition for Riga Airport for Air Baltic. It was a single airlines terminal. We did this with Bureau Happold, and it was a collaboration on code as much as it was on the project. It was pretty much a research project, but the idea was to make the check-in and the arrivals both enjoy a ceiling that became the kind of the energy of the project rather than a roof that's only experienced by departure people. And so one checks in at the ground floor and then rises up through the ceiling to get to the rest of the departure level. So that ceiling is obviously something that we make quite expressive, but it comes from an algorithm that has tens of thousands of agents interacting in real time in relation to structural analysis. And what's going on is there is no global understanding of what structure is. There's only a local understanding of how do I improve my structural condition. And what happens is over a period of time, these interactions start to cause different things to appear in different parts of the building. From like the images on the right are kind of sampling that ceiling. So you get things from a continuous surface like a shell structure down to more articulated things like waffle slabs or trusses emerging. These things just appear as local features. They're not, what you see is not an optimal structural solution at all. It's coming from a 3D model, an architectural intent, that then has to negotiate structure within that framework. And then the expression that's left from that, the ornamental quality, is completely intrinsic to the structural solution. So there's no wasted material. This is a structural solution as much as it is an architectural solution. But it's one arisen through behavior, through algorithms. So this concern we take also goes into processes that deal with topology. Today I'm showing a lot of things about the way we do work, more so than talking about the outcomes. And I think this is just to really articulate this idea that for us, information is really about the information we build from within, in a sense, so that we have some form of design approach which we then respond to the outside world. So we look at references to these things and we build algorithms from scratch that come from an interest in various fields. So I was looking for a long time at Lewis Wolpert and other developmental biologists that deal with embryogenesis, because I see here a topological transformation, something very useful for architects, because we're always trying to design things that, whether we like it or not, deal with topology. So what goes on here is, this is the creation of a stomach, and gastrulation is a process where the embryo, or the multicell, turns inside itself. So it changes its topology. These are some sketches by Stuart Peaver it's, let's say, a very contestable theory. But what's interesting about these sketches is they argue that you could arise at almost any mammal, or in this case you can see sea creatures, crustaceans and things, from a topological transformation of a double torus. And the scientific validity is not really the important thing here. It's more the understanding that you can topologically transform from one of these entities to another that I find interesting. The book's quite crazy, but he goes down all to the level of fingernails and hairs as arising as an event that happens, one event after a time. So after doing this is an algorithm I wrote about 6 years ago or something, 7 years ago, that looks into how event-driven agency can start to evolve topology. And in this case, I road tested it on the DRL for a workshop. And what you see here is every color represents a different entity that has different decisions that it has to make in real time. And after an event, it then might change its state, which then changes its rules. So what you start to see is over time, something emerges and then transforms into something else. And in the case of this workshop, there was no design goal. The goal was to create a continuous change of events and start to see entities emerge from that. So you can see a series of diagrams like this are describing a series of events that happen in time. And what's actually happening there is a population of entities are changing their own awareness, and as they do so, they change their rules to create something beyond themselves. And this is a diagram describing the kind of family of rules the students made. So as I was working through this, I came across Holdobler Dobson's book, Superorganism, which describes, be careful with the wording of that, it's a very dangerous word to use in a lecture. But in that book, there's this graph, and it describes how ants and termites and bees and other social insects don't have the typical stereotypical rules we think they have, such as nurse ant or foraging ant, but actually they change their behavior over time in their lifespan, and also based on their proximity to something. So you might take a forager ant, walks past a rubbish pile, sees the rubbish there, and it decides to take some rubbish out. And this is kind of exactly like our algorithms are working. Not to say that our algorithms are biomimetic at all, but simply that when one entity is within a certain proximity of something else, you can orchestrate another event to create the next thing. So this same algorithm was tested on an opera house competition where you see the start condition is something completely different from the end, but there is something in which to start, what I would call a design template. So this is where the project begins, and this is where the project ends. But the secret to this is that although it looks incredibly linear, it's a very non-linear process, very unpredictable. And so this process had to be redone about 3,000 times at the time, because code had to be changed, design templates changed, there was a programmatic 3D model constantly being tested at the same time. But it turns itself inside out, it pushes through itself, it makes bridge connections, and it's operating in surface tension as well. And this is what comes from that. And all the detail and all the, let's say, the artifacts of that process are the things that give that project its character. There's nothing really added to that. All the little ridges are the things that actually cause the overall volume to take its shape. It's when these series of elements start to move together that they spread tension, which causes movement through the whole structure. And it ends up being a quite muscular thing. And I mean, this is actually one of the interests driving perhaps this work, is where we can basically develop a character for the work that comes from the way it was made. And so in this case, an algorithm is designed not just to form a practical function, it's designed also for, let's say, for the expression or the design intent, one that is trying to control character or develop it from the ground up and trying to develop it differently for each project. In this case, the same algorithms applied to a bridge. In this case, trying to use articulation for structural concerns. So where ridging happens, ridging becomes a structural element rather than just a cosmetic element. So topology starts to reduce structural deflection and stress, and then ridging also does. So you end up with something quite thin and topological. This was a model we recently did for a show in Shanghai, where you can kind of see it's a bit more sinewy. And then we start to talk about assembly, coming back to one of the topics of today, where in this case, even something continuous is assembled, and it starts to become something that adds to the expression of the project. This this idea of assembly also could be generative. It doesn't have to just be, in the previous example, I show you a joint that is an explicit thing, which we do all the time. But also sometimes we look for other ways to think of elements like assembly. So this is for a fabrication studio I ran in St. Louis in the States a few years ago, where we tried to rethink how we could put very tectonic principles within something where we could explore a new kind of expression. So once again, not the desire for something optimal, but actually the desire for something a little bit more extravagant. And this is the only design drawing you need to do this installation. It just describes a series of operations that connect self-similar parts to one another. The parts were deliberately loose in all axes. This is a test model made with 600 plaster pieces. Yeah, but all the pieces have a rotation joint in every axis. So the only way they can stand up like this is if they're connected together in a particular way that limits their movement. So they can go from something self-supporting to something almost like drapery. And this is the final element, which is designed so that it can slide relative to the one next to it, and whenever they sit next to each other, they always form local rotations. But once again, they're completely loose, unless you form a ring with them, in which case they cannot escape one another. So this is the installation. When they form a ring, they can stand up, and as soon as they open out, they collapse. And they're all the same piece. And this thing's really heavy, but its form and its organization is just derived from the way it's assembled. This principle was taken in a project for a public library in Helsinki competition, which came third in a public vote. And it forms actually this yellow part, which negotiates the circulation through an atrium in the middle of the building and becomes a ceiling through the top floor of the library. You can see here where it forms the circulation ramp, and then it becomes this ceiling. So where you see this kind of arching, it's actually self-supporting. And then in the center of the ceiling, it's just a suspended ceiling. So it's the idea suddenly of the same principle being applied, assembly being generative, but assembly not being about supporting the building, just being about something having another quality that it maybe didn't have before that gives it some character. So all those little warps and wrinkles, they're not carved or molded, they're just because of the way the assembly happens. And the assembly is inevitably very vectorial, which is something we also explore a lot in our work. The vectorial relationship between material or matter and space. So this idea of information building other opportunities also applies to environmental projects. So in this case, you have a model for 2 towers in Sao Paulo, and there is a canyon created in the tower that creates a shadow, and that becomes an opportunity for planting, for a sense of passive cooling for balconies. I'll skip, I think, a little bit just to keep time. So assembly going into DRL, I ran a studio for a few years called Behavioral Matter that was looking at qualitative effects of building life cycle. So how you could rethink aspects of building life cycle. And one of those things that a number of projects explored was assembly. The idea that assembly could be a generative thing, but also fabrication could be. So in this case, you have a habitable bridge, which basically there was a fabrication strategy for how you could build this bridge. This team of students worked out how you could build the bridge from unwrapped sections that were hung. So they designed 20-meter sections of building through fiber composite that could be unwrapped, so which included everything down to handrails and glazing systems, well, frames. And then this was hung in a 20-meter scaffold system and then impregnated with resin. These are scale model tests of that process. And then the idea was that you could assemble these on site without scaffolding. So in this sense, a lot of the projects from this period, they're all about how a render like this communicates just as much about the project as a final render. And then the expression of the project had to be intrinsic to the way it was made. So in this case, you see the overlaps again being expressed, and the segmentation of the bridge being something that came from their rethinking of production rather than from design itself. So recently, we just had a review that you might have seen. This has gone into a new agenda called behavioral production, where we try to take these things on in real time. So the time-based algorithms that I mentioned before that went into design are now happening within the actual construction. So we're looking at processes like stigmergy, which are algorithmic logics that you can see, like scientists like Guy Thérèse or Eric Bonabo have talked about that operating in termites. And we were studying in the last year how such algorithms could drive the logics of UAVs and how UAVs could be explored as 3D printers. So in this case, we're really trying to compress algorithms into construction. So something like this is described as a series of 3D printing events through computer-controlled behaviors that are operating in real time. In this case, these are some students working on a project that can develop bridging, and it operates through real-time structural analysis, where the structure is aware of what's going on, and the UAVs can print something with feedback in mind. The students are developing hardware to 3D print. Things such as this. And then developing a time-based sequence. So in this case, this is something that it's a pedestrian bridge that is designed to be constructed without scaffolding by a swarm of UAVs. So it's the idea of trying to revisit, in some sense, some of the expression that you see in things like Victor Horta or Hector Guimard, like where you see things such as articulation of surface or planning in space, fabrication, but also thinking of it through fabrication and through the idea of robotic behavior. The image on the left is Grammatio Koa, and on the right, it's a Hod Libsyn robot that is just, because of its body plan and the way it moves, it has a certain effect on its environment. These are students of mine working with G-code, just controlling a 3D printer to do exactly that. And I'll leave you now with just one last piece. This is a team of students that just finished this week constructing a tensile installation through a swarm of UAVs. So in this case, design has to be totally associated with the production process. And those local event-driven rules become rules for how one constructs actual space. So yeah, I'll maybe leave it on for a little bit. It's slow, or I can speed it up. So I guess the position would be that as designers, that there's a lot that we can define, whether it comes to the character of something as well as the kind of practical results. And then if we can actually start to embrace some of these new technologies and take those on board, then we can also perhaps gain new freedoms and flexibilities in how we think of making things. And I see algorithms as operating within pretty much any framework that we can get our hands on, whether that's literally an algorithm or it's just a way of thinking that's procedural but also open to non-deterministic methods. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I'd like to now invite all the three speakers to join us here on the table just for a quick discussion and Q&A. So I guess we're gonna, yeah. Well, let's check if all these phones are working. Well, I think first of all, thanks very much, Karsten, Versden, and Rob, for the lecture. I think first of all, it's just amazingly interesting how diverse the presentations are and the takes on the assembling reality is. I'm not going to try to summarize because I think probably this will kill attention that exists between the work and between the different approaches. But perhaps an interesting question looking at the presentations, maybe for all three, or for one person to start, is to what extent is it interesting today to think of information and process as different things in architecture? Are they completely related? Because I think all three of you have a process that you're working through, either with communities, mixing different medias, algorithms, also synesthesia and amorphosis. So to what extent there is that diversity today to look at an architectural approach where information maybe perhaps equals process? It's a very personal process question, but maybe just to kick off.
I think I can use this. I think, I mean, for today, I deliberately, as I said, chose the projects which were actually not based on making new forms of architecture, because what we realize by being architects, that a lot of information or parts of buildings and spaces is actually the non-physical. And that's what was interesting me, in particular with these projects where the information is more based on memories, emotions, history, which only was able to exist through the building or the structure or the space. And that's the interesting part. Of course, there's maybe other methods when you create new spaces from scratch, but they would also take into consideration what has been there, the context side, or of course also what the future functions. But I think it's quite interesting how this non-physical or non-tangible or supposedly non-tangible experiences actually how they form a structure or a space.
I guess my answer to that would be that, I mean, I think in all three cases, there's more than just translation going on. There's a creative act that's been quite deliberately done that may respond to different things. So in my view, our work's really focused a lot on the information it creates itself and then how it responds to that information. Of course, it responds to external information, any process, and design's always addressed to external concerns. But the actual creative process itself doesn't come from nothing. It has to be kind of foregrounded or developed towards both a specific response, but also towards a body of knowledge that any individual designer develops over time. And in our case, yeah, a lot of information or data is created through the act of design that is constantly the impetus for the next thing to happen. And I guess the last process I was discussing, stigmagy, really works that way. The principle of stigmagy is that something that's already done becomes information for what happens next. It becomes the stimulus for the next thing to happen. So yeah, for us it's more of an internal thing, that is developed in order to respond and address external things.
I think we share the same opinion here with the other two speakers about the fact that information is actually time-based because we live in a space-time continuum. And we could also say that architecture is not timeless, it's time-full. So it's always full of events. And in that sense, information at any point in time would always be in evolution, in transformation, which is why in my practice I'm trying to use processes of transformation as those essential creative strategies that actually speak about morphogenesis, that speak about condition, and that allow us to express how our world, the one that we perceive with our sensory apparatus, actually operates. So in that sense, it's the only way to consider it as a constantly evolving.
Because there's actually a real difference here between having information, data as inspiration, right, than having something to work with. And I think that there is an interesting kind of perhaps division when once you have something for inspiration. I mean, it's not biomimicry, but for example, that you inspired by a certain form or inspired by something else. And the difference of carving or creating a bespoke method for responding to that, right? And I think that is perhaps if there is a gulf today, that's the discussion that we started with coming from Lebenswood's work, which is radically different from what most of people do today, but there is that intrinsically questioning, right? Even with his meditations and his drawings, but that difference between carving a process and creating the process and creating protocols to check that process, no? If that process, either working with different communities and kind of reconnecting art agents or radios or agents which are not intrinsically connected, maybe the form is able to recreate that. I don't know if I'm making a scarecrow, or do you guys also see that particular division there?
Do you want to clarify a bit between, you mean a division between translation and an agent?
Well, perhaps using information as inspiration for something, as a literal approach, perhaps using the word translation versus not recognizing that any longer. You know, there is a process of metamorphosis or reshaping within the code, whatever code that is.
No, I think, for instance, we've known each other for a long time, Vesna and I, and I can see in Vesna's work, for instance, a clear working through a series of things that internally driven, like, for instance, an interest in music, or a talent in music, I should say, becomes suddenly something that informs another part of the work, or vice versa. And I think it's the same in my work, like that there are things that are developed over time with obviously external goals, design goals, architectural goals. But yeah, I completely agree with the comment that it's not about inspiration. It's more about sometimes finding terms to think through the way you work. And for instance, science for me is also something really important as a reference, a point of reference, whether it's biology or physics, it depends, but it's only a reference. It's never actually the thing driving the work. The work is always driven from either, most often driven by opportunity, thinking about what are the potential possibilities, or is there another way to create something that might be able to address this or that, And initially a lot of our work was focused on, form and space. Then it started to think of addressing a lot of materiality, then structure, environment, just trying to kind of work through these things. And this is from an algorithmic point of view. Once you start dealing with actual projects, then I share a lot of the concerns we see in the other two, when you start to see actually things being materialized. And there are a lot of things, I agree with Carsten, that kind of beyond perhaps the matter or the physical itself of the project.
I would also add that that's in my work the interest for performance as almost a research platform comes in, because it focuses on developing the protocols and then implementing them in the live real-time situation. So in a way it's that observation about the continuous transformation that takes place at every level that you're trying to then encapsulate and bring into the framework of an art piece. And I suppose that what we have probably learned since the development and the implementation of digital technologies in creative fields, and that's a discussion I keep having with the art science environment, it's not about direct translation, it's not about infographics, it's not about representation of information. It's about the creative use and misuse and implementation of strategies that can be detected within those data fields, and how we can use them as constructive tools.
I think that what's really instrumental with that is the recognition that time becomes part of the strategy. Like you see that, you know, in all three presentations, but I think you see that pretty much across the board. Anyone working with any of the technologies you mentioned, for instance, I quite like the comment you made in the introduction about things like 3D printing, surveillance, like that these things they're not yet categorized. They haven't kind of calcified in society into a particular thing, and that they can be messed with. I think across the board, you know, time is something that has become, that's much more, like since we've had a kind of exponential amount of different media in which to operate, technology's kind of offered up lots of opportunities, and a lot of these have opened up time. You know, like whether it's the fabrication time, whether it's the performance time, you know, all kinds of things there that I think are really starting to shape the way we think and the way we create, and also what we consider the actual end product to be. You know, like Vesna's promoting the end product as a photograph, but there was also a performance in there. I think this is a very interesting thing. So time there is quite complex. It's not straightforward.
Yeah, I think for me it's very apparent that that comes down to the total openness of the approach, and I think there's, across the three of us, it's a very similar approach in the sense of true collaboration with other fields and not being the architect who does know how to build and how to do, really listening to a person like in this case, the theater, a person who came up with the radio idea, which we never would have done alone. And I see that in the other work clearly, that there is the openness, the experimental part, which allows to explore different fields, but also allows mistakes. And I really liked it when Vesna said we need to allow failure as well, because out of that comes new ideas or even better results sometimes. And that's something sometimes maybe lacking in the typical kind of approach when you get a brief and you have to build and you have to do what has been done before, which is fair enough. But I think it gets interesting when you say, okay, and we are open now, let's see what can be done as well. And then the information comes in, the different aspects of what space is in the end. Yeah.
I think that's out from your conversation or discussion here now. You have words like continuous transformation, or sort of the process and time is very important. I would like to ask you three, like when do you know when is the final product? No? Because you could actually go into an endless exploration and even throwing more information. So, because we are in a time now with an overload of information, or we know more, as we said in our intro, we know more than we actually wanted to know. So when do you know which information to take, or when it is the final product? Because it could actually go endlessly. No?
Can I go? in our case, almost all of our processes have an end point. Like we create, I mean, for instance, with the students, they create obviously an endpoint to the construction, even if it could continue indefinitely. In the terms of algorithms, same thing. So from a scientific point of view, at least, the types of algorithms we're writing tend to either be approaching near equilibrium or dynamic stability, which means that they kind of arise at a solution. They're not like a keyframe animation that could essentially, where you have the question of do you press stop. So they arise at a solution, but if we're totally honest, then of course the real answer is that the designer's intent decides what point there is to stop. That, you know, like how many times do you rewrite an algorithm, or how many times do you rerun a construction sequence with a robot? It really comes down to when the designer is satisfied that the design criteria has been met, which is a mixture of all kinds of influences, constraints, some of them very pragmatic, some of them very whimsical and creative. And yeah, so I think, at least from my side, that hasn't changed, even if from a technical point of view, there is an endpoint.
It's almost a question as old as any creative field, and you can probably read and hear about all the stories about painters, artists that never know how to stop, and sometimes the canvas literally needs to be taken away from them because they would just be adding that one little drop of paint, which would be too much. And I suppose that for me personally, that's why algorithmic art was never interesting, because it was just showing or experimenting with what can be done and then letting the machine decide what is good. I mean, what is interesting about that is that you can reveal the hidden mechanics of how data interact and how the fine balance between order and chaos emerges in these complex structures. But I suppose that a lot of constraints have to come either from the artist or designer, him or herself. So whether they are aesthetic criteria or whether they are spatial criteria, whether they're criteria of duration, criteria of technology. I mean, we've got this discussion probably going on since the first written discourses on architecture. So I think that it always comes down to developing those protocols, these strategies that are there to support your decision-making process.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the project or the task you are either given by somebody, by a client, or you are doing something out of your own interest. I think there's sometimes a big difference. But usually I think our design or creative approach is quite clear once we have an idea, and we are quite clear about what we want, what elements are in there, and then it evolves, of course, during the process. But we usually tend to rather take things away than adding. But then, like failure or things like with the laser, for example, we obviously built the whole thing in 3D. We did an animation before, very precise and neat, which we wanted somehow, it was in our mind. And then talking to the laser people, and then there were different options, how many lasers, the faster and the more information you can get on the building. And then it turned out, cost-wise, we could afford only 3. And then it created this amazing sketching effect, which was even better than the precise model we have planned. And that's something then of course, initially we were, oh no, we need to have more lasers. No, we wanted this. And then we thought, no, hold on a minute. This is actually better, even though it was in our mind as something different. And then we stopped. We said, okay, it's right now. And that happens often. Do you take things away or things alter themselves during the process?
Maybe you can take a couple of questions.
Someone from the audience has any questions?
No? I do have one last one, because I think we went into a very interesting topic, maybe just the final one, which is that idea of time that was, I think, mentioned kind of across the board. And Nannette kind of hinted at this question of they stop, but I think there's something interesting that word when the designer comes in, right? Or the let's call it the I, or the decision making, or the protocol, who analyze the protocol, who understand the parameters. So to what extent there is maybe a decrease or increase of the role of the designer within these parameters, or assumption of a decrease? Maybe it's not a decrease, but the assumption of the decrease, which might even go into a conundrum of the famous conundrum of, let's say, in cybernetics, when machines do the work, basically the several films. But going back to this question is that to what extent that assumption that the designer within the managing of information, the formalization of it, can and should, or is, or his or her, the team is assessing those moments. Because then there is a relationship with time, but there's also a relationship with not the moment to stop, but the moment to feel perhaps satisfied in the sense of equilibrium or dynamic. In that sense, not just because of taste, but because of a certain inherent logic of the process that the designer or the team can calibrate. If that's a fair comment. So rather than the disappearance of the designer, perhaps it's the assumption of the disappearing of the designer within the process.
I mean,
or at the later stage, let's put it like this.
I do think that there is a lot of assumption going on, that as we start to incorporate different media into the way we design things, that I think the general reaction to that is an assumption that less design's going on. But I actually think not at all. I wouldn't argue that there's more or less. I would just argue that design's reframed within these different things. And sometimes, if it's a very technical thing, it's less apparent to people what those design decisions were. And I think it's up to us as designers to articulate those things. I'm very interested, for instance, in the fact that only 3 lasers were involved, and that the character and the development of the project improved with that. I mean, to me, that makes absolute sense, that once any media is involved, that media is going to play a role in what the outcome is definitely inevitable. And every designer takes those things on board creatively and works through those issues. I think it's a really exciting thing. And the constraints of those media become opportunities as well. You know, some of those things become just practical problems, like how do you maximize whatever you're trying to do with the constraint of, 3 lasers or 3 quadrocopters in the case of the video at the end, versus design decisions, like you said. So, I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but I personally believe that with the addition of media, or with, say, certain technological change, that there's more opportunity for design. So I see design right now expanding its capabilities into lots of fields. As you mentioned in the introduction, messing with technologies, I think is a very productive thing for us to be doing, where we can start to take on sometimes things that may not have been within our field, or something that may have been just a completely practical thing that no designer would have ever imagined is a creative thing, and then starting to rethink how those things can qualitatively add to a design project.
Yeah, and I think it's even not much different to the past, where technology defined what was possible and where people try to push the boundaries and then failed sometimes or succeeded. But I think it's also the possibilities with the new media obviously is to, I think the building process in particular is something where it gets really interesting. And I was very intrigued by this three-dimensional, with the drones, the 3D printing, because that was a moment I thought, then now it becomes, for me, almost realistic, because before it's like you still need scaffolding, very traditional. And I find that very interesting how then suddenly you could imagine if you have a product or a building material which holds up against the weather, etc., and structurally that you can print like that, the building. Before it was still a bit like, yeah, you need scaffolding and then there's joints and things and it will look messy after a time. But I think that we're entering a territory where it might change ultimately a lot in the building industry. It takes still some time, I guess, but yeah. But that's interesting.
Well, I suppose that really points to a couple of things, really. On one hand, the role of imagination in shaping new tools and how these tools then in turn shape our own practice and how that then expands the design possibilities rather than reducing them. And throughout the history, some of the most exciting breakthroughs have happened through evolution of new tools. And I think we live in and work in a very, very exciting period precisely because of that. We've never seen such a fast development of new tools. They are inevitably transforming the way we think, the way we work, the way we interact with the output of a design or an artistic process, and how that then integrates back into the culture. And I suppose that in this period of overwhelming information, it's again very important that we put criteria in place just as we need a brief to start with. I mean, even if you are generating your own briefs as an artist without the client, let's say, you still need those constraints to begin with, like the basic scaffolding, the basic structure, the skeleton in which a composition can unfold. And it's almost as exciting to start developing and cultivating this awareness and understanding of how those criteria might adapt so that they are suitable and supportive of the new technologies and they can work in synergy. Yeah.
I think with that one, we're going to end. Vesna, Rob, Karsten, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Very nice. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, good to meet you all.
Yeah, it's
really interesting.
Really
The drone thing.